anything as a painter. I've got to break through the iron wall between what I feel and what I can express. And my best chance of doing it is here, where my roots are, with the people I know, the earth I know.
Obscenity! Shameful! Shameful and obscene!
What have you to say? I will paint man as God made him, in the glory of his nakedness.
You've done it, Pollock. You've cracked it wide open.
Frida Kahlo was one of the most original women of her time.
Señor Rivera! Diego!
Who are you? What do you want?
I have something important to discuss with you.
Story grounds us. It helps us locate ourselves in the world. There are grand stories, and there are vignettes. We are characters in the larger stories of the world, our communities and families, but we all have our own intimate individual stories as well. There are many ways that these stories are told. One might say that all art reveals something about the artist, but there are many artists whose work purposefully denies any connection to their persona. They try to reflect the outside world, critique social issues, or work through theoretical ideas. However, there are also many artists who specifically mine their personal experience to tell powerful visual stories. But how can someone else's story have meaning for us? In this video, we'll explore the work of some artists who may help us answer that question. Finding out who we are and being able to express that identity freely in the world is sometimes not an easy thing. Canadian artist Miriam Schapiro was an early pioneer of the feminist art movement. She incorporated materials and techniques that were traditionally feminine in her work. Using fabrics, sewing, and appliqué, she created collages that she called femages. She established the feminist art program at the California Institute of the Arts with Judy Chicago to support women artists so that their art might have a more public, consciousness-raising aspect. Deborah Barrett majored in creative writing at college, and after she moved to San Francisco in the early 1980s, began to make art. As a child, she had made toys for herself, and continued this when her son was an infant. A self-taught artist, Barrett's work is often figurative and has a purposely naive style, which allows her sense of humor to come through. Siona Benjamin grew up in a Jewish family in predominantly Hindu and Muslim India and now lives in the U.S. In her work, she mixes the traditional Indian mythology and technique of miniature painting with biblical stories, pop culture, and the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, or mending the world. Her identity, made up of so many stories, becomes the major theme in her work. Although she lives and works in the U.S., Lala Assadi's work explores her identity as a Moroccan woman. In a culture where women must struggle to have a voice in politics, religious, or artistic matters, Assadi's work challenges the fantasy of the Arab woman in the West and the reality of how women are seen in the Arab world. She claims she is not critiquing either culture, but rather she wants to show how the lens of Orientalism influences the view of Muslim women in both cultures. To expose the limits these stereotypes place on all people, Assadi questions the images of the veil, the harem, and Arab calligraphy, usually forbidden to women. Chinese artist Chen Ke uses a purposely kitschy style for her work. Concerned with memory, identity, and personal experience, her art expresses a sense of loneliness that her generation feels from being born into the one-child policy family structure. Traditionally, the bald-headed man is a symbol for being stupid in China. Another Chinese artist, Fong Lijun, uses the image of the bald-headed man in many of his works. Fong uses this symbol to represent the alter ego of the artist as an eccentric outsider, as well calling into question the morality of judging people by their appearance. In a society of 1 billion people, how does one make their voice heard? His figures drowning in water echo the feeling of frustration of the limited possibilities for self-expression. When society labels you an outsider, expressing your story is often a struggle. LGBT artists deal with society's prejudices as a matter of course when exhibiting their art and in their everyday lives. The fight to be respected and receive basic human rights often translates into powerful artwork. Abused as a child, artist David Wojnarowicz lived on the streets of New York for a time as a teenager. His approach to art germinated in this rough, unstable environment, and his early works utilized graffiti and other found objects that had been discarded around New York. He became prominent in the low-rent East Village art scene and took delight in raging against the traditional art world structure. His work was controversial, as it took on the taboo subjects of homosexuality, religion, and politics. In 2010, 18 years after his death at age 37, part of his film, A Fire in My Belly, was removed from an exhibition at the Smithsonian Institute after some members of Congress complained and threatened to withdraw funding from the museum. The segment in question showed fire ants crawling over a crucifix. The Catholic League claimed that it constituted hate speech against Catholics. In his defense, the Andy Warhol Foundation, which had funded the exhibition in part, stated that they would not sponsor future projects at the Smithsonian, and the San Francisco Museum of Art, and the Tate Modern in London scheduled viewings of the films. Lucy Schwab made her work under the gender-ambiguous name Claude Cahun. Her surrealist photographs portrayed the malleability of the female identity. In 1932, she met André Breton and René Creval, leaders of the Surrealist movement in France, and joined the Association of Revolutionary Writers and Artists. She was an active war resister during World War II and was arrested by the Nazis and sentenced to death, a sentence that was never carried out. Her images often depict role reversals, challenging society's notion of sexuality, gender, beauty, and logic. Her surrealist approach to photography challenges the notion of photography as a documentation of reality.
Jusqu'à minuit, résonne en moi ce chant qui digne, ce chant qui porte la voix de mes ancêtres.
Little Lulu, the self-reliant, resourceful comic strip character created by Marjorie Buell in 1935, is transformed into the symbolic protagonist in the paintings of David Falk. She often appears in mutilated or distorted form, but she never gives up. Lulu's stoicism, silence, and cool-headedness is an inspiration for Falk, whose life is threatened by his battle with AIDS. Being gay in predominantly Catholic Mexico, artist Nahum Zenil has felt marginalized most of his life. His work, often incorporating his own image, invites personal scrutiny, but his figures return the gaze back on the viewer. His use of traditional Mexican and Christian iconography challenged the rigid definitions of family and spirituality. He often writes on his work, much like writing a postcard to a friend. This intimacy places Zenil in a vulnerable position, but the openness is meant to disarm the viewer so that true communication is possible.
Ma chère famille, mes chers amis, ça fait...
Feeling pain is part of being human. Tragedy in art evokes a powerful emotional response. Aristotle, writing about theater, thought that when we witness suffering embedded in an artwork, we also undergo an emotional cleansing through sharing this suffering with the characters. Some visual artists share their personal tragedies, create some of the most powerful images in the history of art. Perhaps no artist has captured grief as well as German artist Katha Kollwitz. As a child, she experienced the death of several siblings. Kollwitz lost her youngest son in World War I and her grandson in World War II. Her first acclaimed work was a series of prints based on the play The Weavers, about the oppression and failed revolt of the Silesian workers. Most of her subsequent work dealt with the suffering of people caused by injustice and war. A committed socialist and pacifist, her work was removed from museums by the Nazis, and she was banned from exhibiting. The Gestapo threatened her with deportation to a concentration camp, but by then she was so well known that the threat provoked uproar from the international art community. She eventually was evacuated from Germany in 1943, but much of her work was lost when her house was destroyed during the bombing in World War II. In 1925, the bus Frida Kahlo was riding on collided with a trolley car. She suffered severe injuries that resulted in over 35 operations over the remainder of her life. She eventually regained her ability to walk, but she was unable to have children. She had relapses of extreme pain throughout her life and was often bedridden as a result. Her portraits chronicle her life and her relationship with her husband, painter Diego Rivera. While Diego was the love of her life, he also caused her great emotional pain due to his infidelity. She said, "I paint portraits because I am so often alone, because I am the person I know best." Politically active in Mexico, Kahlo and Rivera were both members of the Communist Party. Kahlo died at age 47, writing in her diary, "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." As a student at Sarah Lawrence College, Swiss artist Christiane Corbat studied world mythology with Joseph Campbell. She believed that self-realization through art could help bring inner peace, which could then lead to world peace. Her husband was a doctor, and she was co-founder of Walking Dreams and Warrior Women, an organization of healthcare professionals, artists, and community leaders. In one of her best-known multimedia works, The Global Heart Project, she combined over 1,000 plaster cast hands from people all over the world to represent the oneness of humanity. Five days a week, from 1995 to 2007, Sarah Hutt would get up to make what she loosely called a self-portrait out of clay before she went to work. It came from her desire to make sure she made art every day. The project ended when she left that job 635 weeks later. Sarah's mother had died of breast cancer when she was 13 years old. In her work, My Mother's Legacy, she inscribed a line from her memory about her mother on the bottom of 1,000 wooden bowls. These bowls are placed randomly in boxes, and viewers read through them in no particular order. A graduate of the Chicago Art Institute, Hollis Siegler first became known as a photorealist painter. Eventually, she rejected what she saw as a male-dominated style and began using a fa naive approach. She focused on an autobiographical worldview. In 1985, Siegler was diagnosed with breast cancer, which had killed both her great-grandmother and her mother. She began making work that dealt with her diagnosis. In 1992, she began a series of paintings titled The Breast Cancer Journal, Walking with the Ghosts of My Grandmothers. These intensely personal paintings showed her emotional response to her illness, but also the triumph of the human spirit over the disease. Another artist who was an early proponent of feminism in her art was Hannah Wilke. Originally a sculptor, her work was some of the first to overtly use the imagery of female genitalia. She eventually moved into performance art and photography, where she used chewing gum to make small vulva sculptures which she stuck to her body. She then posed in various classic pinup poses. This series of work, titled SOS, Starification Object Series, satirizes the fashion industry and the values of feminine beauty, but also bring to mind tribal scarification rituals. In her last work, Intravenous 1992-93, Wilke documents her struggle with a lymphoma and her physical transformation during chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant. This work was published after her death, partly in response to Wilkie's feeling that clinical medicine hides away dying patients, as if dying was a personal shame. Nicholas Africano first became known as part of a group of artists who revived figure painting during the late 1970s. These painters became known as the New Imagists. Africano's early work pitted isolated figures, crudely formed from wax isolated in the expanse of large canvases. These figures were representing his own life, and their isolation on the canvas forces the viewer to engage only with the figures. Africano became troubled by the invasion on his privacy from these personal works, and abandoned autobiographical material in 1980. The history of Africans in America begins with subjugation. In 2013, African Americans still struggle with separation and segregation. Coping with and confronting this situation is what drives the story of some African American artists. After he dropped out of high school at age 16, Jacob Lawrence worked sundry jobs here and there while taking classes at the Harlem Art Workshop in New York City. One of his teachers who recognized his talent helped him to get a scholarship to the American Artists School and a job as an artist with the Works Progress Administration. Lawrence's work focused on depicting important events in African American history. He was only 23 when he completed his 60-panel The Migration series, which told the story of the migration of African Americans from the rural South to the northern cities in the U.S. after World War I. In the 1940s, Lawrence was given his first major solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and he became the most famous African American artist at that time.
Vallée déserte, loin des sentiers que j'ai cru un instant regretter amèrement.
In the 1960s, Faith Ringgold's paintings depicted her view of the civil rights movement. She was also concerned with women's rights, especially African American women. Greatly influenced by her mother, who was a fashion designer, Ringgold began using fabric in her work, combining quilting and painting to make her story quilts. These quilts continued to explore the African American experience, the first one being titled Echoes of Harlem. Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima depicted the story of the image of the infamous advertising icon Aunt Jemima, who embodied the stereotype of the African American woman as a servant to the white master class. Allison Sarr is the daughter of another well-known African American artist, Betty Sarr. Allison's work continues the family interest in expressing the experience of the African diaspora. She studied Southern African American folk art and the art and religion of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa as well. Her interest in these stories of displaced African peoples and how they evolved in the Americas is evident in her life-size sculptures that address the theme of personal and cultural identity. The stigma of the African American as boogeyman is one stereotype that has slanted the view of African American men in too much of the predominantly white American culture. But it is also an image that affects how some African American males see themselves. This ugly portrayal of the other as an element of fear has deep sociological implications for equality in the U.S. Michael Rigg Charles explores these stereotypical images and the power structures behind them. His recontextualization of these hard-hitting images has drawn complaints from some members of the black community. Other members of this community applaud him for his frank approach to this dark side of American society. His satirical product, Forever Free, parodies the false promises of equality made to African Americans by American culture. Neighborhoods acquire identities, sometimes positive, sometimes not. Communities have stories. Telling the right story can sometimes change the identity. Some artists work in and with their neighbors to bring these stories literally to the walls of the community. Founded in 1971, the Chicago Public Art Group brings artists and non-artist residents together in community-based art projects. These projects help the community to reclaim neglected urban areas by publicly showcasing art that expresses the values of the people living there. The CPAG provides leadership and helps public and private organizations raise funds and organize the community beautification projects. Several Chicago area artists will act as core artists on these projects. The murals are completed by students from local schools and other neighborhood residents.
Ma chère famille, mes chers amis.
Judy Baca was a high school art teacher looking for a way to get her students to learn how to cooperate with each other. She helped her class to make a mural on the side of the school. Surprisingly, everyone wanted to work on it, and Baca had her vehicle to teach collaboration. Against the policy of her school district, in 1970, Baca participated in the anti-war protests of the Chicano moratorium and was subsequently fired from her teaching job. Her next job was with the LA Parks Department, teaching art in the predominantly Hispanic neighborhood of Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights had the highest number of gangs in the country at the time. Baca saw these gang members loitering at the parks where she taught, but also noticed the elaborate graffiti that was territorial markings of the gangs. Baca wanted to find a way to turn this artistic talents into a positive for the neighborhood. Her first Boyle Heights project, Mi Abuelita, was successful despite all the problems of bringing together various gang factions, political figures, and local organizations. Despite the wishes of many local politicians, the murals that she helped organize depict both the positive and negative aspects of the neighborhoods in which they appear, a truth that the neighborhood residents insisted upon. Another artist group, known as Groundswell, began in 1996 in New York City to work on collaborative community projects. Much like the Chicago Art Project, Groundswell works with members of the community and residents to bring art to the streets and boroughs of the city. These murals bring color to an otherwise bleak urban landscape.
Salt peanuts, salt peanuts. The name of this salt. Salt peanuts, salt peanuts.
It takes courage to put your story into a not always welcoming world. As we've seen, some stories are transcendent. Certainly there is no shortage of narcissism in the arts. But for those that have something authentic, insightful, and poignant to show, we should consider carefully, for our own development, what they have to share.